All right, OCO Nagad, we're going to go ahead and get started today. My name is Catherine Foreman-Gray. I want to thank you all for being here today for our April Lunch and Learn Lecture Series event. I'm really excited to introduce our presenter today. It's Jennifer Frazee. She is the site director over at Fort Gibson Historic Site. If you're not familiar with Fort Gibson, it was established in 1824 here in Indian Territory, and Jennifer's going to talk about the 200th anniversary of it today and all of the events that they have going on, not only this month as they kick off their events, but for the rest of the year. So everybody, please give a warm welcome to Jennifer Frazee.
Hi, folks. I've got my notes so I don't ramble, because as some of you know, I get onto a subject and I will talk forever until somebody stops me. So let's hope that doesn't happen today. All right, so I'll just go ahead and get into it, and I'll have time for some questions afterwards, and I'll kind of use the map occasionally to orient. You guys are getting a sneak peek because I stole this from our hospital gallery that's not been opened yet to bring here to kind of orient. So we'll check that out here in just a minute. Okay, so as some of y'all know, Fort Gibson has been an attractive area long before it became Fort Gibson. It was a stop on the river highway that facilitated international trade well before European Americans began to arrive, and the wealth of flora and fauna that grew here or flocked to the area made for some thriving communities and also provided some really great trade goods. So the lushness, richness, and ease of travel along the river make it an excellent support to a military outpost, and then a little bit of tree clearing made it to where you could see for miles around, and it's no wonder that General Arbuckle chose this spot to move to from Fort Smith. But the question is sometimes, if they already had a place in Fort Smith, why would they move to Fort Gibson? And the ultimate answer to that question can be found in the U.S. Army headquarters records, where it states that the purpose was to further westward expansion and Indian removal. So European Americans at this time were incredibly land hungry, as we know, and the United States government set about finding ways to feed that hunger. And one way was to expand all the way to the western coast. Since the nation's west hadn't yet been as worn down by disease and violence, nor had they yet been overrun by settlers, and because they were already known, like well-known forces to be reckoned with, the United States decided to begin relations diplomatically, and they needed a foothold in the shifting United States border from which to launch expeditions, and as well as a presence here to ensure all nations from the east were removed. This wasn't easy initially because the eastern nations did not wish to leave their homes. We see even today that some history books say that they agreed to treaties or they volunteered. I've seen some kids' books that say they volunteered to go. But we know that telling a person to leave or to stay and die isn't really a choice, it's coercion at best, right? As was the incredible amount of violence and harassment that the United States allowed in places such as Georgia to encourage, right, the natives to leave. So there was pushback from the east for sure. And then on top of that, while the United States pushed removal policies back east, they also had to figure out what to do with the nations already living here in this area. So the Louisiana Purchase triggered a move by the Osage into the region that the military wanted to move the Cherokee Nation and the Muskogee and the Seminole. So Choteau, who was a French trader, was going to lose trade with the Osage, and so with that purchase. And so he encouraged them to move up to this region so that he can continue trade with them. And so they went ahead and came up here because, I mean, the area is great, you know. They, like I said earlier, they have a lot of really great trade goods that they can get from the region. You've got all sorts of flora and fauna that you can use to support your communities and things, so they went ahead and came up here. So whenever the United States shifted to removal policy, they had to meet with the Osage to negotiate a treaty to get the Osage to move out so the Cherokee could move in. The United States, however, neglected to include hunting rights in that treaty. Maybe it was a lack of understanding with how the Osage viewed land holdings. That's kind of a common theme whenever it comes to United States treaties. There's a difference between how the natives viewed land and their relationship to land and how the European Americans viewed the relationship to land. We have similar real estate laws today, you know, that say whenever you want to purchase land, you have to stipulate that you want to also include the mineral rights, for example, if they're available. So it's not anything really new today, but back then it may have been. I'm not as well versed on that as I probably should be. So whatever the case, it caused violence between the incoming Cherokee and outgoing Osage because of the treaty, the hunting rights going in there. And so the United States had to deal with it, and that's where General Arbuckle comes in. So it became his job to establish a military presence on the edge of the United States, because remember, this wasn't part of the United States, it was foreign to them at this point. And he was also there to discourage anything that would make finishing removal any more difficult than it already was. Arbuckle would also oversee launching expeditions from the fort to meet with nations in the West for that purpose of westward expansion as well. So Arbuckle brought the 7th Infantry to the shores of the Neosho, and there they oversaw the establishment of Cantonment Gibson, some of us will kind of hiccupy it a little bit, and later called Fort Gibson in April of 1824, which is 200 years ago next weekend for you guys who want to come out and visit us for that. They brought supplies in easily on the water highways by keelboat, boats that had flat bottoms, so it's easier to come on those shallow river shoals and things. And they quickly set up a tent city to house soldiers while living quarters were built, and they made plans for the next actions to be ready once the fort was constructed, which took a while. They quarried local stone and built some fantastic foundations, but much of the wood they used initially was green and it didn't really last. It's also a really damp environment out there. We battle with maintaining the wooden structures even today. As some of you drive by, you can probably see the chinkings falling out and things. It's a constant upkeep to keep the structures from falling down around us. They also quickly realized the river, while fabulous for travel, was also great for spreading and breeding diseases. Fort Gibson soon became known as the charnel house of the West, as folks rapidly fell victim to illnesses such as malaria. Natives had an early version of insect repellent that kept these types of diseases away, but it was unlikely that soldiers had access to that or knowledge of it. And since the prevailing medical belief of the time was antiphlogistic medicine, so they believed that the humors are what made people sick whenever they got out of balance, rather than germs causing illnesses, they did not zero in on insect-borne pathogens being the cause of the issue until much, much later. So the first hospital was a windowless log room, and it was not great for healing, I guess. As more people fell ill, medical personnel asked to move away from the bad air by the river, and a new hospital was constructed a little bit further up the hill. And so that is right here. So the old hospital was right down here, and the new hospital would be moved up here where the surgeon's quarters are. And so the surgeon quarters can be seen in the 2 chimneys standing halfway between the Palisade and Garrison Hill up here. And the bones of the Ash Street Hospital that the surgeons serviced are inside one of the private homes across the street there. Now, there are plaques on there, I have to point out, that say it was the home of Jefferson Davis while he was an adjutant here, but that information was put up during integration and it's incorrect. Davis was here, but as a lieutenant, and he was in a tent about a mile away from there with the rest of the soldiers who were waiting to head to the Mexican-American War. So he wasn't here. There was another hospital that was built up at the top of the hill. You see the big one up here that says hospital, but that wasn't begun until after the Civil War ended. In the early years of Fort Gibson, it quickly became a really bustling place. The soldiers and enslaved people brought with the Southern officers or from wars back east steadily worked on constructing living quarters, kennels, stables, granaries, bakehouses, and other supporting structures. And they also had to tend to large gardens to support their rations and do work similar to what they would have done in civilian life back home. So they were doing things like coopering, blacksmithing, and clerking, or they were kept busy doing their duty rotations in the kitchen, the guard shack, or off on patrol. Life could also be really boring out there as well. Contrary to popular belief, natives were not constantly on the attack, and they only really caused what they would consider trouble whenever they were provoked by encroachment or violence enacted against them. For European Americans, soldier or otherwise, injury or death came far more often in the form of disease or accident. And a lot of folks, as an aside, seem to have gotten themselves killed by accidentally shooting themselves. There was a lot of accidental shootings at that time too. Here at Fort Gibson, it was disease and accident that was most likely going to take people away. So soldiers also went AWOL on occasion due to boredom, a wish to return home, or the abusive nature of life in a 19th century military service. Records of punishment for soldiers here consisted of bucking and gagging. So they would tie their arms behind their back, put them on a 2x4 and lift them up so that like their weight was all on that little narrow spot on the board, and then gag them. Or they would put them in the stocks as an example to others to not mess up, or they would imprison them in dark cells, kind of like solitary confinement, or hard labor. In one case, which was kind of entertaining a little bit, 2 guys were sentenced to dig a well, but in the course of their work, they soon came against a large boulder, and they dug around and under it just enough to make a nice little cozy spot to play cards and dice for a little bit. Every so often, they would bring up buckets of stone and dirt to make it seem like, oh yeah, this is some really hard work, we're really doing some great stuff down here, until they were finally caught. And in the time they'd been playing around down there, they could have dug several hundred feet, and they only went less than a fraction of that distance. And I never saw any indication to say whether or not anybody continued the work and actually hit water at that point. Visiting civilians could also sometimes break up the monotony out there as they passed through, using the fort as a sort of hostel, like an inexpensive hotel area to stay that they knew was safe. Or they came specifically to visit folks living at the fort or around it in the community that built up. So Washington Irving and George Catlin, for example, came through. They stayed there at the fort, and they even went on the expeditions with some of the dragoon expeditions going out to meet with the nations in the West. Sam Houston also came here to visit family friend Sally Nix, and he stayed there for a while as well. Sally Nix herself was a person to know and wealthy in her own right before her marriage. So her husband was J.J. Nix, and he ran the sutlery located near the river where the keelboats docked. So their store was right here. And so folks on post and civilians from nearby communities would be able to come out and purchase things that they needed from him. And his death was actually another source of excitement, particularly among the officers, whether married or not, because he left his business to Sally whenever he died. And she is likely the first woman to receive a military commission to operate a sutler store. This made her even more of a catch than she already was, because she was also wealthy before she married him, and she was considered to be a beauty back in the day. So the men of the fort constantly wooed her, and one gentleman had all eyes and ears on the fort on him in his attempt. So a visitor staying at the fort recorded in a letter or journal that one evening, early morning, like way early in the morning, the whole post was woken up by the loudest caterwauling they have ever heard. And soldiers and visitors alike jumped from their beds into their weapons, sure they were being attacked. Judging by the noise, he said, somebody had to have been being attacked. It turned out it was a captain who drank a lot to try to give himself some courage to go serenade Sally Nix by moonlight. And the awful, horrible sounds they heard were him trying to sing to her. So I imagine that must have been pretty embarrassing whenever he recovered from the hangover. So there were moments to break the monotony, but for the most part, it was a little bit boring out there for folks. Some folks are also surprised to find out that forts were not the secure places we see in military bases today, but sometimes sort of open to pretty much anybody who was passing through. The walls were not completely built around the structures until much later, and even then it didn't encompass the whole area. They depended upon the geography for protection. They constructed redoubts and other points of defense as well, and there were also folks other than soldiers living here. So like we talked about just a minute ago, the people enslaved by members of the military lived here, and there was a very thriving slave trade actually running through there as well that we're finding. There were also women employed by the military living here. Women served in many roles in Fort Gibson, such as laundresses directly employed by the military with full military rations, the use of the post surgeon, and other things that regular soldiers out there would have been able to use. They also worked as kitchen aides, surgeon's assistants, and seamstresses. The laundress seamstress position was the most highly sought after, though. Not only were they paid by the military for work, but they were also able to take in jobs such as mending, sewing on patches, alterations of uniforms, and the like. They were also the first paid in pay call as well. So on payday, soldiers would line up outside the pay clerk's office, and the pay clerk would be inside at his desk with the stacks of money and the list of soldiers who were to be paid and how much they were to be paid. And right next to him sat the laundress that was attached to that group. And so whenever a soldier came in, they would say, okay, you get $13 this month. And then they would turn to the laundress and say, how much does he owe you? And then she would say, $5. And so he would give them $5. And then sometimes the sutler would be there as well, but they really didn't care if the sutler got their money as much as they cared if the laundress got her money. So they would give him the rest of his paycheck after she had been paid, and they would go about their business. So these wages were how laundresses were able to make a healthy living. And it also made them very attractive, obviously marriage material. They were also considered an asset to the military, which drew the ire of the officers' wives who were not. They were considered, the officers' wives, a burden to the military. They were most often demanding. We could kind of call them Karens, if that helps you kind of envision them a little bit. They were a little bit troublemakers in a lot of cases. They also had to pay their own way out to the post, which bothered them since the laundresses were brought out by the military. They had to pay to ship their household goods as well, and the military provided furnishings in part to the laundresses. And sometimes, whenever the officers' wives arrived here, there was no place to settle their things as homes hadn't been built for them yet, or there wasn't enough room in the quarters assigned to their husbands, or there were no rooms at all because soldiers who outranked their husbands took up all available space. There were also children here, and soldiers brought their families with them in some cases, particularly the officers, but also sometimes families were created whenever children were born during the course of soldier service. Children also of the Cherokee, Seminole, and Muskogee nations were out here with their families as they lived here waiting for home sites to be selected, or they had journeyed to get part of their pay that the United States owed them, the regular paycheck that they were to receive. And then some even came with their communities during treaty negotiations or dispute hearings, because they would have some dispute hearings out there as well. It was a very, very busy place, Fort Gibson. Now, once everybody was a bit settled, they began launching expeditions such as the Dodge-Leavenworth expedition or the Bean and Boone expedition, and that was to meet with nations in the South and in the West. They went all the way down to Texas to kind of help negotiate some peace things between the Caddo, Anadarko, and Comanche, and then they would go out west to as far as Colorado to be able to negotiate peace with the Kiowa and Apache and Cheyenne. And these expeditions, like I said earlier, were accompanied by folks such as Irving and Catlin, who recorded the adventures as well as the flora and fauna of the lands they passed through. And Arbuckle was also charged with establishing roads and building bridges out there. So Frazee also checked on paths and trails that natives had established centuries ago, many of the roadways being built upon them or parallel to them. In 1845, after years and years of pushing for it and begging, Congress made funds available to expand the living space at Fort Gibson because it was kind of run down by that point. And so they were able to start the construction of the stone buildings on Garrison Hill. These buildings, such as the barracks, half of which we still have today, if you guys want to come out and check those out, were constructed by immigrant soldiers and a few hundred black Seminole people who were brought to Fort Gibson from the Seminole Wars. So they told the armies over there that, or they told whenever they got here, they said that they had been offered freedom in exchange for surrender. And so while those claims were being processed and investigated, the military, of course, put them to work. In 1857, again, after many years of asking for their land back and for a military presence to leave their region, the Cherokee were finally successful and the military abandoned Fort Gibson. So Cherokee Nation then established the town of Tahlequah, and civilians were able to purchase improvements on lots. So the small community that had grown up over the years since the force establishment grew a lot larger. But this was short-lived, though, because then the Civil War comes. And whenever the Civil War came, the Confederates moved into the fort. But they were only here for just a skinny minute before they realized the United States Army was coming back, and so they left. So General Blunt came to Fort Gibson at that point with 3 Cherokee regiments, 4 Kansas cavalry companies, Hopkins Battery of Volunteers, and the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, which is the first all-black soldiers unit in the history. So during this time also, the fort was renamed Fort Blunt. So it went from Cantonment Gibson to Fort Gibson to Katua to now Fort Blunt. It was from here that General Blunt marched his soldiers to meet General Cooper and his Confederates at Honey Springs in one of the most diverse battles in our history, and there broke the Confederacy in Indian Territory. And if you guys are interested in learning about that, Honey Springs Battlefield has amazing, amazing displays, exhibits, and tours on that. So whenever Blount and his men rode back to Fort Gibson, now called Fort Blount, one of the men in the 1st Kansas also found himself in the middle of a family reunion, which is one of my favorite stories. Fort Blount had become a place of safety for people, and refugees kind of flocked to the area looking for safe haven, right? And one of those refugees was Jim Tom, who was a formerly enslaved man who was sold away from his family as a child. And on that day in the summer of 1863, he saw his brother in the U.S. soldier that was coming back from the Battle of Honey Springs, which was just amazing to see. And we have records of it. So Adam at Honey Springs, he has kind of a journal that was kept at that time, some memoirs. So with the Civil War, we not only saw advancement in black freedom, we also saw advancements in the field of medicine. So women were learning from the Crimea War, they were learning from Florence Nightingale, and they were also learning from their loved ones who were putting their bodies on the line in wars. And so they began to improve medical hygiene practices through the Sanitation Commission. So we know women had been employed by the military for decades by the time the Civil War got here. And they had fought in various battles, either as themselves or in disguise, as long as battles have been there to be fought. But with the Sanitation Commission, they were now able to fight one of the highest killers of soldiers of the time, and that was of disease and infection. So women such as Harriet Markham, who was a free woman attached to the 1st Kansas, and many others worked tirelessly in tending to the ill, assisting surgeons, and they even helped wounded folks get home whenever they couldn't fight any longer. Whenever they were discharged from the military, they were the ones that were getting the soldiers back home to their families. They also established rules for hygiene put in place to prevent death from infections, which we still benefit from today. As an aside, at the time, it was decided that the male surgeons probably wouldn't like to hear that they were doing things wrong from the women, and so a male figurehead was put in place at the Sanitation Commission so that they wouldn't be offended by getting those instructions from a woman. After the Civil War, construction projects continued, and the military received funds to finish much of the stone buildings at the top of Garrison Hill and a new hospital, which is the 1870s hospital that is under construction currently, and hopefully will be open very soon. So the hospital was state-of-the-art, and it also became Oklahoma's first weather station. So my office is at the top floor up there, and it faces towards Muskogee, and from one of those windows, I can see all the way across the river, across Muskogee to Honor Heights Park. The view is just amazing. And then the Widow's Walk at the top that they would walk around up is another, I think, 30 feet above my office. So you could see for miles around up there. Over time, military posts were established further and further west, and the Army left Fort Gibson once again. They only really came back whenever crime started rising to help the Light Horse police the area. So what happened was, with the Reconstruction treaties, they were allowed to bring railroads in, and in some of those, so they would bring the railroads in and the workers would need a place to stay. So they would establish what we know of today as man camps. And this area wasn't really great. So it increased crime in the area. And the area became attractive to outlaws, European American railroad workers who stayed on after the railroad line moved. They were squatters hoping to settle here. And then eventually they also helped kind of destabilize the nation from within, and that's what kind of led to statehood there. So the military came in to help the Light Horse police the region and keep folks safe, and then they also briefly occupied the officers' quarters and parade grounds outside the barracks during the Dawes Commission as well, and folks came from all over to be placed on the rolls, including freedmen and black natives. So once the commission ended and Oklahoma became a state, parts of the fort were slowly sold off, deconstructed and destroyed, or used in the construction of other homes and buildings in the area. During the WPA era, QB Boydston led the charge to build a replica of the Palisade, and that is what is there today. Families and other agencies worked to collect and preserve Oklahoma history of the area, and over the years, eventually, Oklahoma Historical Society was able to get much of the property, the site that we know of today, the 80 acres out there, through purchasing and then some donations as well. Today, we operate Fort Gibson Historic Site as a living history site and living history museum. We have living history activities on Fridays and Saturdays from September to May. We hold discussions and programs in air conditioning in the hotter months because we know summer's not great around here. A lot of what we have been working towards will also be on display during our 200th anniversary activities next weekend. And that's on the 20th of April. But we will also hold a few other programs throughout this year. We have a third Indian Home Guard that's in development right now, so that date will be put up a little bit later. We have demonstrations that we're going to hold on the preparation soldiers underwent to prepare for those expeditions that I talked about a little bit ago. That's going to be on the 27th and 28th of September. And then we're also holding a Freedmen Commission program in November that will include gallery space for some of the photographs taken during that time, and hopefully a recreation of the dance social held by some of the folks who had come to sign up on the rolls. One of the buildings that's at the top of the hill, it's ruins now. That was where Captain McKinnon headquartered, and that's where a lot of the freedmen for the Cherokee Nation were put on the rolls, was there at that building. You can keep up to date with what we're doing out here by following our Facebook and Instagram pages. And once we are past the 200th anniversary weekend and I can breathe again, we're going to launch programs on our YouTube channel as well. Do you guys have any questions for me? I don't know. I tried not to talk very fast. I have a really bad habit of that, but do you guys have any questions for me? It was a Cherokee Nation decision. I'm not sure on the communications between people on whether or not, like it shows, from the town of Kentua, Cherokee Nation or not, but there are documents that we have come across in our collections, and then a lot of books talk about it, like Grant Foreman, my brain just melted, Dr. Agnew, and others, they've written about the change in names as well. Oh, I can try. That's not my area of understanding. I haven't gotten a lot of education in that. So preservation, I'm going to try. I might mess it up. So what we do out there is we preserve it. So we make sure that everything that we are doing, on my side at least, we are building back or creating in the same way that it was in the 19th century. And then what was the other one?
So preservation versus restoration.
And restoration, from what I understand from our construction and maintenance guy, and I might have this reversed, restoration is just restoring the building. I'm not sure, or the artifact or whatever it is, I'm not sure if there is a big enough emphasis on making sure the historical accuracy is there in that building. So like the hospital that we're redoing, for example, we are doing restoration work on it. They really weren't focused on making sure that it was exactly as it was back in the 19th century because we've changed some things around, right? So like the dispensary is no longer upstairs where it used to be, and then there was a wall taken out of it, that sort of thing. But the person who's doing the construction work on it is a preservationist, and so he is, say, milling the lumber to the exact specifications of the lumber that was there before. The banister that's going up to the second floor is of the same type that they had in the 1870s blueprint, or actually 1860s blueprint of the hospital. So that's as much as I can say on that subject. I'm sorry, I can't help you more with that one. So there were a lot more houses, and I will keep this up for just a little bit before we all have to be out of here. If you guys want to check out, because it kind of outlines some of the homes and things that were there, the buildings that were there. Initially, when they first got there, they established what we call Tent City, just hundreds of tents all across the grounds. But once those buildings start getting built up, they were able to make barracks there. In the palisade, you can see some of the rooms that were similar to what they would have been living in at the time inside the palisade, but then they also had home structures that they built, and then the dog trots that we have, which are basically just two log cabins attached by a breezeway. And so those kind of things were there. So whenever people were coming out to live on post, they would have been living in places like that or in the homes in the community that was surrounding. Now when the Civil War came, they were living in tents. They were living in whatever lean-to or anything they could live in to get in that area of safety at that time. Yes, that is. I'm glad you brought that up because we are actually in the process of, so everything, my boss is David Fowler, and he is very big in 19th century agriculture, particularly with traditional crops that people were growing at the time, and trees and things. And so we go through there and we look for invasive species that we've got marked off to get rid of. We want to reestablish some traditional, not only crops and things, but regular plants like medicines and such, because we're wanting to also interpret what was going on there before the military settled in there. And then another thing that I really would love to do that I need to talk to Cherokee Nation about, maybe Pat Gwynn could help me with that, I'm not sure. But so they built a monstrosity of a water treatment plant right there, and so whenever you go on site, it used to be you could be stepping back into the 19th century, and now you got that big old blue building sitting right there in the way. And so I would like to establish a stand of river cane going along in front of there to block that off, and then also be able to have Cherokee Nation traditional artists come out and harvest it and use it for some of their projects too, because we would be able to do a huge one. I know that there's one here in town that they have, but we would be able to do one probably about 5 or 6 times that size, and that might help to kind of reestablish some of that too, especially since we're right there by the river. So at the time that the fort was in use, they clear cut everything because, for defensive measures, so they would be able to see everywhere. We've got a couple of photographs, and I tried to get that fit in the back of my car because it's got a fantastic photograph of that river, and you can see just how far they cut everything down, but it would not fit. So they would clear cut that area, so they weren't able to really forage out there so much. But there were woods all around the area that people would be able to go out into. I don't know so much about the battles. I'm not as well studied in that just yet, because for the most part, there were no battles around Fort Gibson. They could see, so they went out to meet trouble. So I know they did go out. They went down to participate in the Florida Wars. I know that. And then also some of the guys from the Fort Gibson went down to participate in the Mexican-American War as well, and the fort was garrisoned at that time by folks from Arkansas. They came over and kind of watched the fort during that. And then I believe some of them went out to the Battle of Poison Springs. That's where the Confederates took revenge on the 1st Kansas for the defeat at Honey Springs. So they did participate in that. And I know there's more. I can't recall off the top of my head.
Yes, that was a great presentation by Jennifer, and feel free, I'm sure she'll stick around for a little bit if we have any other additional questions, and then also this map that's got more information on it behind me. I do want to point out that next month, the May Lunch and Learn will be held on Tuesday, May 14th. We'll have Dave Kennedy. He is the curator of collections and exhibits at the U.S. Marshals Museum, so I think he's going to bring a few artifacts over too, so I'll be excited for that, what they have Cherokee that's in their collection. So again, that'll be Tuesday, May 14th, same place, same time here. Yeah, and we'll stick around for a few minutes if you guys have any additional questions. Thank you.